What happens when a quiet Hollywood star suddenly refuses to stay silent and challenges one of the most outspoken voices on live television? What happens when a routine morning interview slowly turns into a tense confrontation that no one in the studio expected? Before we get into this unbelievable moment, make sure you subscribe to The Truth Narrator, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Because on this channel, we reveal the most dramatic and unforgettable moments from live television. The bright studio lights glowed over the famous round table of The View. The audience clapped as the cameras rolled, expecting another casual celebrity interview. At the center of the table sat veteran host Joy Behar, known for her sharp humor and fearless questions. She had interviewed hundreds of celebrities over the years, and very few ever challenged her on live television. Across from her sat Kristen Stewart. Kristen looked calm, almost quiet, the way viewers had seen her many times before. She wasn't the loud Hollywood type. She rarely tried to dominate interviews. Most of the time, she answered politely and moved on. But this interview would not follow the usual script. The hosts began with light conversation, asking about Kristen's latest film and her recent projects. The audience laughed, applauded, and everything seemed normal. Then Joy leaned forward slightly. Her expression changed from playful to curious. "Kristen," Joy said, smiling toward the audience, "you've been in Hollywood for years now, but people often say you seem uncomfortable with fame." The audience chuckled softly. Kristen gave a small smile. "I've heard that before," she replied calmly. Joy continued, "I mean, fans love you, but sometimes in interviews you look like you'd rather be somewhere else." A few people in the audience laughed again. Kristen kept her composure, but her expression shifted slightly. "Well," she said, "I think sometimes interviews can feel a little strange." Joy raised an eyebrow. "Strange how?" Kristen paused before answering. "Because people often think they already know who you are." The audience murmured quietly. Joy leaned back in her chair. "Well, that's part of being a public figure, right? Fans get curious. They want to know the real person behind the movies." Kristen nodded slowly. "I understand that," she said. "But there's a difference between curiosity and assumptions." The atmosphere in the studio began to shift. The other hosts glanced at each other briefly, sensing the tension building between the two women. Joy smiled again, but this time it carried a sharper edge. "So are you saying the media misunderstands you?" Kristen didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned slightly forward in her chair. Her voice remained calm, but it carried a firmness that hadn't been there before. "I think sometimes," she said, "people try to define you based on a few moments they've seen on camera." The audience clapped lightly. Joy nodded. "Fair point," she said. "But when someone becomes a global celebrity, people expect a certain level of openness." Kristen looked directly at her. "And that's where it gets complicated." Joy tilted her head. "Complicated?" Kristen took a breath. "Because sometimes the questions aren't really about understanding someone." The studio grew quieter. Joy narrowed her eyes slightly. "What are they about then?" Kristen answered without hesitation. "Sometimes they're about pushing a narrative." A soft wave of whispers moved through the audience. Even the other hosts seemed surprised by the direction the conversation was taking. Joy leaned forward again. "Are you saying that's happening right now?" Kristen held her gaze. "I think it might be." The audience reacted instantly. Some gasped. Others laughed nervously. The tension was suddenly undeniable. Joy placed her mug on the table slowly. "Well," she said with a thin smile, "this just got interesting." Kristen gave a small smile of her own. "Yes," she replied quietly. "It did." The cameras zoomed closer. Producers behind the scenes watched carefully as the conversation drifted far away from the friendly tone they had expected. Because what started as a normal interview was now turning into something much bigger. Something real. And something that millions of viewers watching at home would soon be talking about. But the most shocking moment of the interview hadn't even happened yet. Because in the next few minutes, Kristen Stewart would say something that would leave the entire studio completely silent and force Joy Behar to respond in a way no one expected. The studio atmosphere had clearly changed. Just moments earlier, the conversation had sounded like a typical talk show interview. Light questions, friendly laughter, a relaxed celebrity promoting her latest work. But now the energy inside the studio felt completely different. The cameras were still rolling, the audience was still watching, but there was a noticeable tension sitting between Kristen Stewart and Joy Behar. Joy adjusted slightly in her chair, giving a small smile as if trying to keep the moment light. "Well," she said, looking toward the audience, "this is live television. Sometimes conversations go in unexpected directions." A few people laughed. Kristen didn't laugh. She remained calm, her posture relaxed, but her eyes stayed focused on Joy. Joy leaned forward again. "Let me ask you something honestly," she said. "You've been in the spotlight since you were very young. Do you ever feel like the media has treated you unfairly?" Kristen paused before answering. "I think the media is complicated," she said. Joy nodded. "That's a diplomatic answer." Kristen smiled slightly. "It's also a real one." The audience clapped softly. Joy tilted her head again, clearly curious now. "But earlier you said interviews can feel like traps." "That's a strong word." Kristen shrugged gently. "Sometimes it feels that way." Joy tapped her fingers lightly on the table. "Give me an example." The room grew quiet again. Kristen looked out toward the audience for a moment before speaking. "Okay," she said slowly. "Imagine walking into a conversation where someone already decided what kind of person you are." Joy crossed her arms. "And," Kristen continued, "and then every question is designed to prove that idea right." A few audience members murmured in agreement. Joy let out a small laugh. "Well, that's television." Kristen nodded. "I know." Joy leaned forward again, her tone now slightly sharper. "But you have to admit something, Kristen. Sometimes celebrities send mixed signals." Kristen looked at her. "What do you mean?" Joy gestured lightly with her hand. "You say you want privacy, but you're also part of a business that depends on attention." The audience reacted with a mix of applause and murmurs. Kristen didn't immediately respond. She took a breath. Then she leaned slightly closer to the table. "You're right," she said calmly. Joy smiled, as if she expected that answer. "But here's the thing," Kristen continued. The smile on Joy's face slowly faded. Kristen's voice remained steady, but the tone carried more weight now. "Being an actor doesn't mean giving up the right to be human." The audience erupted into applause. Joy raised an eyebrow. "No one said you weren't human." Kristen nodded. "I know." Then she added something that made the entire studio fall silent. "But sometimes interviews forget that." A few people in the audience gasped softly. The other hosts glanced at each other again. Joy leaned back, studying Kristen carefully now. "So you feel misunderstood?" Kristen shook her head. "Not misunderstood." Joy frowned slightly. "Then what?" Kristen answered quietly. "Overanalyzed." The audience laughed and clapped again. Joy couldn't help but smile at that. "Okay," she admitted. "That's actually a fair point." For a brief moment, it seemed like the tension might fade. But then Joy asked another question. And this one changed everything. "Let me be blunt," Joy said. The studio quieted immediately. Joy looked directly at Kristen. "A lot of viewers think you come across as distant." A few uncomfortable murmurs came from the audience. Kristen stayed calm. Joy continued. "Sometimes people say you look annoyed during interviews." The room felt heavy now. The cameras captured every detail of Kristen's reaction. She didn't look angry. She looked thoughtful. Then she said something no one expected. "You want the honest answer?" Joy nodded immediately. "Always." Kristen leaned forward slightly. "The honest answer," she said, "is that sometimes the questions feel less like curiosity and more like judgment." The audience reacted instantly. Gasps. Whispers. Even one loud wow from the crowd. Joy blinked, clearly surprised by the directness of the statement. "So you think I'm judging you right now?" Kristen didn't hesitate. "I think you might be trying to." The tension in the room suddenly doubled. One of the other hosts shifted nervously in her chair. The audience leaned forward, completely captivated now. Joy placed both hands on the table. For the first time in the interview, she looked slightly defensive. "Well, Kristen," she said slowly, "that's not my intention." Kristen nodded. "I believe you." Joy studied her carefully. "But," Kristen gave a small smile. "But intentions and impact aren't always the same thing." The audience exploded into applause again. Even some of the other hosts couldn't hide their reactions. Joy shook her head slightly, half amused, half surprised. "You came prepared today," she said. Kristen laughed softly. "No." Then she delivered the line that pushed the interview into completely new territory. "I just decided not to stay quiet." The studio fell silent, because everyone watching could now feel it. This wasn't just a celebrity interview anymore. It had turned into a real confrontation. And the next thing Joy Behar said would push the conversation even further. leading to a moment that would later explode across social media and leave viewers arguing about who was actually right. The tension in the studio was now impossible to ignore. Just minutes earlier, the conversation had felt like a normal daytime interview. But now every word carried weight, every pause felt longer, and the audience sitting inside the studio of The View could sense that something unusual was unfolding right in front of them. Joy Behar leaned back in her chair, studying Kristen Stewart with a look that was part curiosity, part challenge. The crowd was quiet now. No one wanted to miss what came next. Joy finally spoke. "Well," she said slowly, "you definitely surprised me with that last comment." Kristen gave a small shrug. "I didn't mean it to sound dramatic." Joy smiled faintly. "But it did." The audience chuckled nervously. Joy leaned forward again, resting her hands on the table. "You said earlier that interviews sometimes feel like judgment," she continued. "But don't you think celebrities also judge the media?" Kristen tilted her head slightly. "Of course they do." Joy raised an eyebrow. "So it goes both ways." Kristen nodded. "It does." For a moment the conversation seemed balanced again, like both sides were stepping back from the edge. But Joy wasn't finished. She looked directly at Kristen and asked a question that immediately tightened the atmosphere. "Then let me ask you something honestly," Joy said. Kristen looked at her calmly. "Okay," Joy continued. "Do you think actors sometimes hide behind the idea of privacy because they don't want to answer uncomfortable questions?" A soft ripple of whispers moved through the audience. Kristen didn't react right away. She thought for a moment. Then she answered. "Sometimes." Joy seemed surprised by the honesty. "But not always," Kristen added. Joy nodded. "Fair enough." But then Kristen leaned slightly forward, and the tone of the conversation shifted again. "The problem," she said, "is when curiosity turns into expectation." Joy frowned slightly. "Expectation?" Kristen nodded. "Yeah, when people start believing they deserve access to every part of someone's life." The audience clapped again. Joy lifted her hands slightly. "But celebrities benefit from that attention too." Kristen smiled faintly. "That's true." Then she added something that made the room quiet again. "But attention isn't the same as ownership." Several people in the audience gasped softly. Even the other hosts at the table glanced toward Kristen with widened eyes. Joy leaned back, clearly thinking about that response. "That's an interesting way to put it," she admitted. Kristen remained calm. "You can share your work with the world," she continued. "But that doesn't mean the world owns your story." The audience broke into loud applause. For a moment, Joy simply listened to the reaction. Then she smiled again, though the tension was still there. "You know," she said, "this might be the most intense interview we've had in a while." The crowd laughed. Kristen smiled too. "Sorry about that." Joy waved her hand. No. It's good television." The audience laughed again. But Joy suddenly leaned closer across the table. Her voice lowered slightly. "Let me ask you one last thing," she said. The room went quiet again. Kristen nodded. "Go ahead." Joy looked directly at her. "When people criticize you online, when they say you seem cold, distant, or uninterested, does that bother you?" The audience waited. Kristen paused for a moment. Then she gave an answer that no one expected. "Honestly." Joy nodded. "Honestly." Kristen looked out at the audience briefly before speaking. "It used to bother me." The room was silent. "But not anymore." Joy raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" Kristen smiled slightly. "Because I realized something." Joy leaned forward. "What?" Kristen answered calmly. "People usually judge the version of you they created in their own heads." A wave of murmurs spread across the audience. Kristen continued. "They're not reacting to the real person. They're reacting to the story they think they know." Joy slowly nodded. "That's actually pretty deep." The audience laughed softly. Kristen shrugged. "It took me a long time to understand that." For a moment the conversation felt calmer again. But then Joy said something that reignited the tension instantly. "Well," she said, "some people might say that sounds like avoiding criticism." The audience gasped. The other hosts looked toward Joy in surprise. Kristen didn't look offended. But this time her response came faster. "I'm not avoiding criticism," she said. Joy crossed her arms slightly. "No." Kristen shook her head. "I'm choosing which criticism actually matters." The audience burst into applause again. Joy laughed. "Okay," she admitted. "That was a good answer." Kristen smiled. But then she added one more sentence that made the entire studio freeze. "And sometimes," she said calmly, The loudest criticism says more about the person asking the question than the person answering it. The audience erupted. Gasps, applause, laughter. The reaction filled the studio. Joy blinked in surprise. Even she couldn't hide her reaction this time. "Well," she said slowly, shaking her head with a smile. "I walked right into that one." The audience laughed loudly. But the moment had already taken on a life of its own. Because millions of viewers watching at home were now posting clips online, debating every word that had just been spoken. Some people believed Kristen Stewart had brilliantly defended herself. Others believed Joy Behar was simply asking the questions everyone else was thinking. But the most shocking part of this story was still ahead. Because when the interview finally ended, what happened next, inside the studio and across social media, would turn this tense conversation into one of the most talked about talk show moments of the year. For a few seconds after that last exchange, the studio felt completely different. The audience inside The View had just witnessed something rare on daytime television. A conversation that had moved far beyond the usual polite celebrity interview. At the table, Joy Behar slowly shook her head with a half-smile, clearly surprised by how intense the discussion with Kristen Stewart had become. "Well," Joy said, letting out a small laugh, "this might be one of the most honest conversations we've had here in a while." The audience laughed and applauded again. Kristen smiled politely, but the emotional energy of the moment was still hanging in the air. The other hosts finally joined in, trying to lighten the mood. One of them joked, "I think the internet is going to have a lot to say about this interview." The audience laughed again, but everyone knew that statement was probably true. Joy turned back toward Kristen, her tone softer now. "You know," she said, "I respect the fact that you answered everything directly today. Not every guest would do that." Kristen nodded slightly. "I think conversations are better when people are honest." Joy lifted her mug with a grin. "Well, you definitely were." The audience applauded once more. But the tension of the earlier confrontation hadn't completely disappeared. Viewers at home could still feel it. Joy leaned back in her chair and added one final remark. "You know, sometimes the best interviews happen when people disagree a little." Kristen smiled. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Sometimes that's the only way to get to something real." For a moment, the entire table fell silent. Then the host beside Joy turned to the camera with a bright smile. "And that's why we love live television," she said. The audience burst into laughter and applause. Moments later, the segment ended. The cameras slowly pulled away from the table as the show moved toward a commercial break. But behind the scenes, the conversation everyone was having was no longer happening on the stage. It was happening online. Within minutes, short clips of the exchange between Kristen Stewart and Joy Behar began spreading across social media. Viewers who had just watched the moment live were already posting their reactions. Some praised Kristen for calmly standing her ground. Others defended Joy, saying she was simply doing her job as a journalist. On platforms like X, TikTok, and YouTube, the debate exploded. Kristen Stewart just owned that interview. Joy Behar asked the questions everyone wanted answered. This was the most real moment on daytime TV in years. Thousands of comments poured in. Some viewers analyzed every word Kristen had said. Others replayed the moment where Joy admitted she might have walked right into that one. Clips of the interview started gaining millions of views within hours. Even entertainment news outlets began discussing the exchange. Articles appeared with headlines like, "Did Kristen Stewart just challenge daytime TV?" Joy Behar and Kristen Stewart's tense live TV moment goes viral. What made the moment so powerful wasn't yelling or drama. It was the calm intensity of the conversation. Two strong personalities, two different perspectives, and a live audience watching it unfold in real time. Back inside the studio, after the cameras stopped rolling, the atmosphere was much lighter. Kristen and Joy reportedly shared a quick laugh as producers prepared for the next segment. That's the strange magic of live television. Moments that feel intense on screen often fade quickly behind the scenes. But once the audience sees it, the internet never forgets. And for viewers watching that day, the conversation between Kristen Stewart and Joy Behar became one of those unforgettable talk show moments that people would keep debating long after the broadcast ended. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think Kristen Stewart handled the interview perfectly? Or do you think Joy Behar was right to ask those tough questions? Tell us your opinion in the comments below. And if you enjoy dramatic, shocking, and unforgettable television moments like this, make sure you subscribe to The Truth Narrator, like this video, and share it with someone who loves behind-the-scenes celebrity stories. Because on this channel, we bring you the moments that made millions of viewers stop, rewind, and ask one question. Did that really just happen on live TV? Clapperboard.